Holy shit. Oh man, stop what you're doing, pause this video, open up Steam, and go download Hrot and play through the latest episode, kids. It is wild, somehow even weirder than the previous episode, and if this is any indication of what the finale has in store, then... For those of you who are still on the fence about Hrot, or have somehow not even heard about it, sit down, buckle up, because this is it's a tough one to explain. Hrot entered early access in January 2021 with the release of Episode 1, Kiss Me Gustav. I picked it up day one and it was the first written review I did for this channel, so I have been literally following this game since I first started all of my YouTube shenanigans. Now, after multiple quality of life improvements and upgrades, Episode 2, The Degustation, is available to play with 8 new maps, including one secret map that of course takes place on a train. Episode 2 takes what made Episode 1 so good and so unique and dials it all the way up past 11 to deliver a tight, unsettling, brutally challenging experience that refuses to let go. Seriously, kids, I played through the new content twice in a row just to get a feel for it. Once on hard because that's my preferred setting, and once on normal just to be able to focus more on the design. And I can't express just how much developer Spytenyev has found the perfect groove for this game and dialed it all into perfection. For those kids who need a brief catch-up, Hrot takes place in Prague 1986, and a strange, unknown occurrence has dramatically transformed the landscape. Strange monstrosities, soldiers and cultists, and supernatural events are everywhere. We play as an unnamed Czechoslovakian soldier, who I have dubbed Comrade Hrot Guy, running around trying to figure out what the actual fuck is going on in order to bring some sort of salvation to our once peaceful socialist state. If Hrot looks like it borrows heavy influence from Quake, rest assured that it does. It also borrows liberal influence from Dusk. Hrot maintains a healthy sense of identity despite wearing its influences very proudly on its sleeve, although I'm not sure if this counts as healthy, and establishes itself as a bona fide classic and immediate icon in the growing wave of modern indie shooters. Look, kids, if you couldn't tell, I'm just gonna gush about this game. And honestly, why the fuck not? How often when playing any genre of game can you honestly say that you have witnessed a landmark in gaming as you played it? It's pretty rare. Sure, there are games that release that we all enjoy or add to our personal favorite lists, but it isn't often that we can feel the air change around us as we play the game. Hrot is one of those games. In identity, in presentation, in execution. Hrot is an FPS title that takes the established base of those games that have come before it, stirs it into a sweet-tasting smoothie, vomits it all up, and presents it like a Rorschach test. The first episode of Hrot focused primarily on introducing Comrade Hrot Guy to a slowly disintegrating world where potentially fascist forces were invading the land, while focusing on the body horror of a world where nuclear energy is a looming concern. After all, the Chernobyl disaster happened in 1986, the same year the game is set, and while the narrative never outright points at or implies that nuclear energy has anything to do with the goings-on, it's hard not to sense the presence of the notion. Guards wear gas masks and hazmat suits. They vomit uncontrollably, sometimes even in combat. What sounds like a Geiger counter can be heard whenever specific enemy types are around. Whatever is happening here, and rest assured, I have no fucking idea what is happening here, there is a sense of radiation, of poison, of corruption in the natural world, something leaking and spilling over into our own, which permeates everything we see in Hrot. The brown palette, which would seem drab and boring in any other game, feels here in service to the rampant toxicity spreading across the world. Even the sky is hideous, a swirling mass of black and gray, like a hole in the air has opened up and threatens to swallow us whole. Now, of course, if this sounds as though the entirety of the proceedings in Hrot takes itself as seriously as the dire circumstances present themselves to be, then you would be mostly right. Hrot is not without a twisted sense of humor. Clearly self-aware of the memes in the market, Hrot carefully keeps itself in check with the tiniest of touches, such as the delicate farting noise whenever a power-up fades away. Or the ability to literally take a shit in any of the game's toilets. Only once per level though. Comrade Hrot Guy isn't that regular. There's a section in the main menu labeled Dank Stuff. There's a mini-game where you play a farmer catching chicken eggs. Armor pickups come in the form of coins, medals, and wife beaters. And the ability to regain health by chugging bottles of wine that you can pick up and stack. Oh, this reminds me of my first marriage. Hrot straddles a delicate, dark line of black humor, which is just enough to lighten the veil of horrific atmosphere, but never truly distract from the odd terror that we are experiencing. Yeah, if the first episode of Hrot felt like a fever dream, this feels like David Lynch's Eastern Bloc, because the weirdness and the strange events hit even harder this time around. There are fake-outs, and visions, and jump scares, tactically employed to great effect. The first episode also leaned more on the idea of body horror, a loss of self, a loss of bodily autonomy. Something I've noted before in other videos is very present in Eastern European horror. There were mutations, what appeared to be genetic experiments, implications that whatever was going on was due to a grievous miscalculation of science, and even then the game flirted with the weird, presenting enemies in the shape of a horse with a gas mask, a gorilla with mancubus rocket arms, and possessed gym equipment. Here, with episode 2, the supernatural, the ghostly, the unseen really takes more of a hold. There's a portrait that comes to life if you perform an action that it doesn't like. Your flashlight will flicker in the presence of certain ghostly ghouls, strange visitations, zombies, even a grandmotherly statue which may or may not be following you. This escalation of events doesn't nudge Hrot over the line into outright horror though, not in the same way that Dusk is a full-on horror game. But there's enough here that, more so than episode 1, episode 2 of Hrot made me nervous and uneasy, peeking around corners rather than charging headlong around them, as I wasn't really entirely sure what fresh hell would pop out at me next. Viciously as well are the enemy encounters, including more than a few instances where something would be waiting on the other side of a door to jump out and explode me to shits and bits. I was caught off guard more times than I care to admit. In this sense, episode 2 also ramps up the tension on an action perspective as well. There are 2 specific times where the game throws multiple waves of enemies at Comrade Hrot Guy, to the extent where the end of said combat encounters felt more like the end of a marathon rather than an intense sprint. Somehow Spytnev walks a tightrope wire throughout the course of the entire game thus far, from slow, intense exploration to brief bursts of explosive combat to extended waves of chaotic survival. And the level design here is on fucking point. Where the first episode did and still does leave me scratching my head in places as to where I need to go next, episode 2's level maps are all tightly wound despite feeling as open as possible. You'll start at one corner of the map, usually facing down corridors and locked doors, sometimes with a locked door immediately off to the side of the opening area, and proceeding forward the maps unfold with a natural, looping flow that rarely forces you to backtrack in order to get what you need, unless you accidentally miss something because you weren't paying attention, like I do. There's a few underwater swimming segments which force the player to act and think fast and find air. There are multiple pathways to meander down which lead to the same spot, so you don't need to retrace your steps as often. It's just so goddamn good. I get lost easily in maps a lot of times, so a lot of meandering is my own in certain cases, but these maps feel like small puzzles to be deciphered as you go, with many of the solutions being more clever than they ought to be. Oh, and if you thought the motorcycle bit in the Duke Nukem Forever 2K1 leak was cool, allow me to present... Eat your goddamn heart out, Duke. Now, I've been gushing and going on about this game for a while. And you know what? I honestly find it more difficult to write scripts for games that I have a lot of praise for versus games I'm critical of. And I think it's due in part to the fact that, yeah, when I say something is good, it's really good, and I genuinely don't want to spoil any of it for anyone who might be coming down the pipe to try it out. Of course, that being said, I do need to talk about the final boss fight here in this episode for just a minute or two, so skip to this time frame if you don't want any spoilers.
Okay, 3, 2, 1, let's jam.
Okay, so unlike episode 1, which featured a lengthy level leading up to a slightly underwhelming boss fight, the finale of episode 2 is a brutally fucking challenging survival scenario in which Comrade Hrot Guy gets to face down the floating head of Gustav Husak, which continually teleports in fodder enemies as you struggle to stay alive in a contained area, circle strafing like your life fucking depends on it. But wait a goddamn second, Dad, you say out loud to me in a voice only I can hear in my head. Who the goddamn shit is Gustav Husak? Okay, let's get into the lore of Hrot for a second. First off, Gustav Husak was the first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia for 20 years, and was the president of Czechoslovakia for 14 of those 20 years. He had deep, deep ties to Soviet Russia, something which was famously highlighted by his fraternal kiss shared with chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, Leonid Brezhnev. Now, the socialist fraternal kiss was a symbol of good relations between communist countries, usually done on the cheek 3 times, but to highlight particularly excellent relations between countries, state heads would share said kiss on the mouth instead. So Gustav was seriously in pocket with the Russians during his time as president, so much so that he undid most of, if not all, of the sweeping liberal reforms his predecessor had enacted the decade before Gustav came to power. So that being said, episode 1 of Hrot, titled Kiss Me Gustav, ends with Comrade Hrot dueling with the reanimated and mutated body of former Czech President Klement Gottwald, who was the first communist president of Czechoslovakia. Episode 2 of Hrot, The Degustation, ends with Comrade Hrot eradicating Gustav Husak's floating head. So to that point, thus far, despite the anomalous events and weird imagery, Hrot appears to be a thinly veiled criticism of both the presidency of Gustav Husak and the general reign of communism in Czechoslovakia in general. You get all that? Yeah, I'm still working on this theory because there's honestly a lot more to it once you start going through the history of the country, and when Hrot episode 3 releases, you better believe I'm going full game theory on this bitch. Alright, shit, where was I? Oh, right, the boss fight. Gustav Husak's floating head. It took me nearly an hour of pounding my head against the wall in frustration to finally defeat this insane battle, because while the level opens up by giving you a generous wealth of ammunition before diving in, enemies don't drop nearly as much ammo as you expend during the fight, so you'll be torn between doing damage to Gustav and clearing out fodder who are the only ones attacking you, since Gustav doesn't do any direct damage. Now, for the most part, the boss fights throughout Hrot are as simple as outwit, outlast, outplay, but this sets the bar way high for the rest of the game, as this, not to overuse the word, is just fucking brutal. I had a couple of runs where I got down to just my melee weapon and had no other option and chose to let myself die just so I could restart the encounter. In recent memory, the last 2 boss fights I can recall that gave me this much trouble were the Elder Banshee at the end of Viscerafest Chapter 1 and the boss at the end of Turbo Overkill Episode 1. And the fight against Gustav, or I should say, the degustation, isn't an unfair challenge. It is simply a test of brains and brawn combined, much like the rest of Hrot. It forces you to consider ammo output in as tactical a manner as possible, all while staying hypermobile and avoiding damage while dealing the utmost amount of destruction as you can muster. And at the end of it all, when you reign triumphant, the feeling of victory is indescribable. And, like a good soldier of the socialist nation, I chose the option to pick up the pushback at the end and clean up after my mess before moving onward. Hrot is weird, merciless, tongue-in-cheek, and an absolute blast to play. But this is also after close to 1.5 years of updates and improvements that Spytnev have provided for the game. There's a neat kick mechanic in place now that I love. You press shift to kick just like Duke's mighty foot. New armor upgrades and health items have been implemented into the game, my favorite being a full meal of soup, dinner, and cake. The wine bottles for health are brand new as well, and one of my favorite aspects is the bestiary, where you can look at models of every enemy you killed in the game. Spytnev has done a lot. A lot. Controls have been smoothed out, combat has been tightened up, gunplay feels more impactful, graphics have been cleaned up while still looking intentionally muddy and grimy. There is so much here to enjoy, and if it feels like I'm glossing over any bits of this game, that's kind of intentional. I could absolutely go on at length about a whole host of aspects of Hrot, from the uranium mine level with the clever callback to Half-Life's On a Rail chapter, but this isn't the kind of game that I personally want to go on at length about. I fucking love gushing about good shit and talking to other people about it, but Hrot defies description. This is the kind of game where if I could, I would just grab people and sit them down and boot up the game for them so they could experience it themselves. Hrot is a blistering, intense, fast-paced, sometimes terrifying, always intense, fully 90s throwback FPS. There isn't a single wasted weapon, there isn't a single dull moment in any of the tightly designed maps, and there isn't a single explanation for anything that is going on here in this weird fucking game, which is one of the game's biggest strengths. I liked this when it first hit early access, and after seeing the improvements and evolution since then, I've fallen in love with it. Hrot is a game that needs to be played to be believed, and I'm going to give the game thus far a 10 out of 10. Holy shit, kids, I am still a little weary and exhausted from this episode. I'm looking forward to more of this game as it comes out, and at this point in time, Spytnev hasn't provided any clues as to when to expect the 3rd and final episode. But if things stay on track, then my guess is sometime next year. When that happens, I'll be doing a complete and total review of everything in the game, from top to bottom, episode 1 to episode 3, including those theories I have about the narrative and what exactly is going on here. So, for real, and I mean this sincerely, if you enjoy first-person shooters, and I bet you do or you wouldn't be watching this channel, go play Hrot. Overwhelmingly positive on Steam, a true icon in the new renaissance of first-person shooters. Alright kids, I always take a quick summer break in July, so that means you won't be seeing me posting any regular content for the next month or so. I'll be streaming every Sunday with the Ranger Station crew, or sometimes solo if that's the way it works out. But I will be posting some patron-only content over on my Patreon, so if you feel like joining up, maybe tossing a couple dollars my way, because this stuff isn't, cheap, I would not only really appreciate it, but I'll be making some really cool shit for you kids to enjoy. Now that said, sit up straight, stay hydrated, and go call your mom when you get a chance and tell her you love her. And I'll see you next time, kids.
Zahrajmy na tego,